We are continuing through the book of 2 Corinthians. It's really a letter about encouraging each other. And I'm hoping that as we go through this, we can learn how to be an encouraging church. But today's passage deals with a difficult subject. You see, there was a person in the church in Corinth who was taking advantage of the members of the church. He was robbing them blind, as it were, and he needed to be disciplined. And the first letter to the Corinthians deals with a lot of that discipline. The second one is kind of a follow-up where Paul is saying, it's not all about just whapping down the bad guys. Sometimes we need to encourage the good guys. Well, today's passage I have entitled, Great Crises Produce Great Courage. Until we've been through some crises in our lives, we really aren't equipped to do leadership. When I graduated from seminary, I was the youngest person ever to graduate from San Francisco Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity. But I had been working in youth ministry for about 8 years, and I had been through seminary, so I was convinced I knew everything there was that needed to be known about being a pastor. And so I just delved headlong into it. I got a call to a church in Reno, Nevada, called St. John's Presbyterian Church, but there was an interesting little caveat to the call. You see, the pastor had been removed by the presbytery for administrative style. That means they couldn't catch him doing anything wrong, but he was tearing the church up. And the executive presbyter, Bob Graham, told me, he said, "Don't worry, you can go ahead and take the call. The guy who's the interim pastor is wonderful. He's going to be there for a long time, and you'll be able to participate in the interviews with the new pastor, and so everything's going to be just fine. Even if the permanent judicial committee clears the pastor's name, he won't accept reinstatement. He'll just move on knowing that his name has been cleared." 2 months after I got to the church, the permanent judicial committee reinstated him, and he accepted the reinstatement. I had a new boss that I had never met before who had been in lots of trouble for doing bad things. Not only that, but I had a new congregation because all of the people that didn't like him, when he came back, they left, and they were the ones that hired me. And all the people that liked him came back, and they said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm the youth pastor." I lasted 2 years, and it was a horrible, difficult time. The new old boss and I didn't see eye to eye on anything. In fact, one time he came into my office after I had done a Bible study for the session talking about being called by God, and I expressed to them that I felt that I was called by God to be a pastor. And he came in my office and he said, "You seriously believe all that stuff," he used a different word, "about being called to the ministry?" And I said, "Absolutely." He said, "Well, you're never going to last very long." That was 30 years ago. But I lost my job, and I had a brand new baby boy and no employment. Well, God helped me through it, ended up okay, but I learned a lot about how crisis produces courage. And I want to talk about that this morning. The first thing that crisis does is I think it produces compassionate hearts. And Paul tells us that when we go through crises, we become hands-off of others' faith. You see, we Presbyterians believe that your relationship with God is between you and God. It's not between you and me and God. It's between you and God. I'm not going to come in and tell you what you have to believe and how you have to do it. It's your thing. You have a direct line to God. You don't need me. I'll give you some advice, most of it good. But it's It's between you and God. Paul says, we're not in charge of how you live out the faith, looking over your shoulders, suspiciously critical. We're partners, working alongside you, joyfully expectant. I'm the pastor of this church, but I'm not the whole church. I'm just a teeny little part. We're all the church together, and when we work together, we do amazing things. Second thing Paul tells us is that we become focused on others' welfare. Too often churches get focused on having the correct theology. And the next thing you know, they're fighting over disagreements that they have about theology. Meanwhile, folks' lives are falling apart and they don't pay any attention to it. I think I told you before, there was a Baptist church somewhere in the deep south that split over whether or not Adam had a belly button. Now that may seem kind of funny, but if you think about it, he was never actually born. Did he have a belly button? In fact, there's a whole religious movement focused on the fact that Adam did not have a belly button. And you ready for this? They're called navalists. And they've been so influential that in the World War I Army manual, there was an act of Congress that removed a picture of Adam because it had him with a belly button. Now, how many people in that church that fought over Adam's belly button were hurting, were lonely, had suffered through a tragic illness or a tragic loss of someone they cared about, and they weren't cared for because everybody was fighting about belly buttons? When we go through crises in life, we begin to understand that people's welfare is more important than being absolutely correct on every single theological issue. The third thing that Paul tells us is that we become driven by our love for them. I didn't write it to cause pain. I wrote so you would know how much I care. Oh, more than care, love you. You know, we Christians have to remember that we're supposed to love one another. Jesus said, they will know you're my disciples because you love one another. I want our church to be characterized by how much we love one another, not by how correct we are theologically. I mean, good theology is important, but I'll take mediocre theology and a whole lot of love. Fourth thing that Paul tells us is that we become less troubled by failure. You know, a lot of people have a fear of failure. I'm not afraid of failure. I just don't like it very much. But I've only failed about 3,267,000 times. In fact, I think I failed 3 times on the drive over here this morning. But if we're focused only on failure, then we lose life. You see, failure teaches us more than success ever will. We learn a whole lot more from messing up than we do from doing things right. And when we've been through difficult times in our own life, failure's not that big of a deal. We can survive that. And finally, Paul tells us that the crisis that produces compassionate hearts leads us to become more resolved towards restoration. Now's the time to forgive this man and help him back on his feet. If all you do is pour on the guilt, you could very well drown him in it. My counsel now is to pour on the love. If we're doing this faith thing right, then we become more resolved towards restoration. We don't care if you do it right so much as that you learn how to love one another. We want relationships to be restored because that's where the joy comes from. The second thing that Paul tells us is that crisis produces a conquering faith. When we go through difficult times, it produces a faith that can conquer all of the difficulties we face. And when we go through these crises, we begin to know that God is leading us. God had opened the door. All I had to do was walk through it. The more difficult times we've been through and come out through the other side, we can look back and see, I know now exactly where God was leading me. I know now exactly what God wanted me to do. If we focus on the results of those crises in our lives, we begin to see where God is taking us, where God is leading us. And secondly, we know that God triumphs through us. In the Messiah, in Christ, God leads us from place to place in one perpetual victory parade. If all we do is focus on the crises, it looks like we're failing all the time, like God doesn't care about us. But if we understand that when we move through these crises, God grows us and strengthens us, we can begin to see how these difficult times help us triumph through the rest of our lives. Third, we know that God works through us. Because of Christ, we give off a sweet scent rising to God, which is recognized by those on the way to salvation. I hope that you are able to step back from your life enough to look at the difficult times you've been through and how they've helped you and how they've helped you help one another. You know, we have so many folks in this church who've been through difficult times and then helped other folks. We have folks who have been through difficult cancer situations and have the opportunity to offer an encouraging word for those who are going through it now. We have so many folks who have lost a spouse and can come alongside someone who just lost a spouse and can encourage them. Not tell them how to do it, but to tell them, I'm here for you. We had a lady who was in the church office a little while back who had just lost her husband, and a very wise man who had lost his wife said just one simple line to her: don't do anything for a year. Don't make any decisions for a year. Because a year from now, you're going to feel a whole lot different than you do right now. What amazing advice. What a caring thing to say. God works through us. And finally, we know that God empowers us. This is a terrific responsibility. Is anyone competent to take it on? No. None of us are equipped from birth to be able to handle all these crises and to help one another. But in the same way that the glass blower heats up that glass in the fire and then shapes it into just the right form, we get shaped into the right forms because of the fire that we go through in our lives. And at the end of those difficult times, we have something beautiful to share. We've been empowered to go through things that no one was born with the competency to handle. We get what we say straight from God and say it as honestly as we can. You know, none of us has all the answers. I certainly don't. I'm learning more each and every day. But there's one thing I do know. When times get tough, when the crisis is happening all around me, God is there with me, strengthening me, shaping and molding me, so that when I get through the crisis, not only am I a better person, but I'm able to be there to help others as well. We could probably go around the room, and everybody here, I bet you, has a real sad story to tell us about a difficult time they went through. We'd be here till about 6:30 tonight, though. But we've all been through that difficult stuff, and because of that, each of us has something special to share with others. Each of us has a strength to give to another person. Each of us has the opportunity to share the courage that we've learned through our crises. I hope that you'll reflect on some of the crises that you've been through in your life. And I hope that you'll try and find in them the strength and the courage that God gives you to help others. Because if we become a church that pours on the love, instead of most of them other churches out there that are real good at pouring on the guilt, we can do amazing things together.